All right, me. It is early March, and I've just finished reading Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. This is one of 4 novels by Zora Neale Hurston. The story of Hurston is a sad one. She was a part of, for a point in time, of the Harlem Renaissance, right? Which is huge in the fact that it's one of America's first big sort of encampments of African American experiences, African American writing. And she was part of it, and then personal life kind of got involved in that. And her ideas and ideals didn't always match up with some of the major components or some of the major leaders that with the Harlem Renaissance. And so she eventually was kind of more or less pushed out, which is unfortunate because she is just such a fantastic writer. Zora Neale Hurston would eventually, 10 years after writing this, I think it was about 10 years after publishing this book, would be working as a maid in Florida. And then I think after 2 or 3 years, she would then be, have passed away in effectively a welfare house, right? She suffered a pretty massive stroke, and then one of the really great American authors, who had just had such a command of word and command of dialect, would pass away broke and penniless. And all of her books, all of them were owned by major publishing company, and so she saw very little money, and her family saw very little money that came from these books. And so owning this book in this way, right, is both an honor to her, right, because we want to honor writers and have their physical things, but also it is a detriment, right, because the money that was bought the money that was earned when this book was initially bought, right, because I bought this secondhand, did not go to Hurston or her family. It would have gone just to the publishing company, which is sad, right? The book itself, right, Their Eyes Were Watching God. The title comes from chapter 18 or chapter 19, which I'll get more into later. But this story, I mean, really to me is all about, right, hopes and dreams, which, links, that's like the whole Harlem Renaissance, hopes and dreams, and how do we articulate that, right? But it's also about intersectionality, right? And it's one of the things where I hate to pin down an author into the way that we think about them, right? Because, and I've done this too, and I'm certainly not perfect, but right, with women authors, we tend to focus greatly on feminism in their books, and with queer authors, we tend to focus very much on, what does it mean to be queer in their literature, right? Because of who the author is, we inherently tend to look at those pieces in their art, right? This is no different, right? And to me, right, the big thing that stands out is the way that the Harlem Renaissance effectively pushed her out. I think has a lot to do with intersectionality, right? Because it's not just that she is an African American, right? It's not that she's a woman, she is an African American woman, right? And so, right, she has two of these societal expectations that are going against her, and in doing so, right, is that in falling in line with one, often you break the other, right? And so it's like you can never win, right? This book does touch on that a little bit. At the very end of the book, right, is when chapter 19 is when this really focuses in on this, right? But the book itself, we follow Janie, and Janie to me seems to be like this encapsulation of what we think of when we think of the Harlem Renaissance, right? Right. I think the most famous piece of work that comes out of this is at least, I should say, the piece that I've seen referenced the most often that comes out of this, right, in my experience, is Langston Hughes's Raisin in the Sun, right? And that's, the piece that comes from the Harlem Renaissance that I've seen referenced the most often and talked about the most often, which is all about this encapsulation of hopes and dreams, and how do we perceive them even if they have to be put away for a while, right? And Janie is effectively a representation of this, right? Janie is effectively born from the granddaughter of slaves, right? Her grandmother was born into slavery, and then her mother was also born into slavery, and then, but within the same year, according to the book, I think off the top of my head, around a year-ish old, was emancipation, right? Which obviously, as hopefully we all should know, emancipation did not free African Americans from slavery, right? In fact, it took another 2 years to actually remove slavery in all accounts, right? But, right, so we're looking at basically first generation, maybe you can argue second generation, born out of slavery, right? And Janie has hopes and dreams, right? She has this dream of what she wants, which is this big, beautiful, right? The willingness and the ability to talk about ideas, right? And beauty and wonder in the world. And her grandmother, who was raising her, has effectively said, that's not going to be possible for you, right? What you need is a stable life so that you never have to work again, right? And Janie then goes on to talk about this later, chapter 17, 18-ish, in which, right, it's not that she hates her grandmother, it's just that she hates this conceptualization of what it meant to have a good life, right? The grandmother had a life that was completely work in slavery and had no love, right? And in the grandmother's eyes, as it is portrayed, as well as the eyes of those around her at this point in time when she's 17, is that Janie's life is best lived when it is, I don't want to say all love, but when there's an absence of work, right? That is like the peak of life, right? And Janie basically gets two cracks at this, right? She first gets married off to an independently wealthy man who owns quite a few acres, but wants her to like consistently work all the time, and she's not in love with this guy, right? This guy's just a dirty, disgusting person, right? Not someone who functions well in living with someone, right? Whether it be in a relationship or not. And so from that, Janie then runs off with what's his name? Oh, geez, oh, Pete's. Oh, geez, oh, Pete's. Starks, Jody. That's his name. Jody Starks, who initially encapsulates this all love no work, right? Is that Jody is someone who looks to be this, you know, sweet talking southerner. He has this immense charisma that everyone's drawn to him. They go down to what would effectively be St. Augustine, I believe, right? And in an attempt to build like an all-black settlement that is free in Florida. And what immediately ends up happening is that Jody has these ideas of, right, wealth and ownership that is innately tied with success, right? And so Jody is immediately going to work and immediately putting everyone to work. And as described when Jody is dying, right, is that there was this love that existed when Janie first ran off with Jody, right? Of this expectation and this feeling of this great love that coincides with one another. And what it eventually became, and very quickly became, I should say, was Jody's first love was always his own creations. And Janie, as this, you know, great, beautiful young woman, who's also a very headstrong person, right? Jody's creation of Janie would be to turn Janie into a submissive woman, right? And right, that's just not who Janie is, right? And so their marriage very quickly falls apart, but they remain married for 20 years because Janie does the thing in Langston Hughes' poem, right, which is the dream shriveling up and dying, right? She compresses her own dreams and refuses to see them, let them see the light of day, right? Because of the societal expectation of women, in which once they have money and once they've been provided for by a man, therefore they should be thankful for everything, right? Which is a thing that we still see to this fucking day, right? But that's not inherently, right? Giving financial money and support to someone does not inherently make them love you or inherently make their life good, right? And so Janie's struggling with all of that. And everything just kind of falls apart, right? Jody basically, you know, is so involved with this idea that when she has to control her, is that when she eventually does speak up for herself, right, as she's getting older, that he basically says, fuck you, and leaves and moves to a different part of the house and effectively exiles Janie from his life, right? But still expects her to run the store and everything, right? Because one of the big things that happens is, right, Joni is 10 years younger, about 10 years younger than Jody is, right? So Jody is getting old very quickly, right? So we learned that he has failing kidneys. So he's getting very old very quickly, and there's this refusal to acknowledge within himself that he's getting older, that he's no longer this picture perfect example of what masculinity should be, right? And so he's pushing all of this on to Joni, who's now at this point about to be 40, right? She's like late 30s at this point, but still, by all accounts, looks incredible as a human being, right? Still a very attractive woman, according to all descriptions. And Jody is pushing all of this and all of this frustration, all this anger onto Janie, right? And right, he's constantly forcing her, like putting her to humiliating situations, humiliating her, like making fun of her publicly, right? He has basically put it so that Janie is not allowed to have any sort of fun in her life, right? She's always forced to be the one that works when things are going on, right? And when Janie was like, hey, fucking stop it, dude. You're no spring chicken yourself. He gets upset. He abuses her. It's not the first time that he has abused her, and then that's when everything falls apart, right? He gets incredibly sick, and then everything is left to Janie. And then we get another one of these great hypocrisies, right? Of where Janie is now widowed, and immediately men are courting her, right? Is that men are trying to get her attention, trying to, you know, get her services in some way, right? Because she is not only beautiful, but she's also rich, right? She's immensely rich. And she's turning them down. She goes through, you know, this 4 or 5 month, 6 month period of grieving, right? Which is the effectively mandatory process that existed at this time. And then she goes through about 3 months of mourning, right? And then she decides that she's going to get married. The problem is that she's not getting married to someone that is also wealthy, right? And not one of the people that have been courting her this entire time. She gets married to Tea Cake, who is broke, who is transient, right? Is constantly moving places. And it's this great hypocrisy, right? Of where when she makes that decision to marry Tea Cake, the entire town and everyone around it is immediately against her and hates her, right? Because, oh, she's getting married too early, you know, all this jazz, you know, you should be mourning over Jody, completely ignoring the fact that she has had constant male attention for the past 9 months, trying to get her attention, to get her married immediately, right? But it's when she chooses who to be married to that suddenly it's a problem, right? So her and Tea Cake married. They start moving around Florida, bouncing around Florida. They eventually moved to the Everglades, and within the Everglades, right, we have there's a couple major scenes, right, in which we start focusing a lot more on Tea Cake and what he's doing, right? But generally what we see is, and the reason why Janie decides to marry Tea Cake, is that Tea Cake treats her as a person, right? Tea Cake does not expect her to act in a very specific way because she happens to be a woman, and does not expect her to act in a very specific way because, you know, she happens to be black, right? She's just allowed to be a person and is allowed to do things like laugh and play checkers and learn things, right? And that's why she eventually decides to marry Tea Cake, and we see this continuing more and more throughout all these adventures throughout the rest of Florida. They go down to the Everglades. Big character that we meet at the Everglades are the Taylors, I think is the last name. Taylor. Off the top of my head, it's Taylor. I'm going to say Taylor because I can't find it off the top of my head. But, so, we have Taylor, and the Taylors own a whole bunch of land or some sort of restaurant, something of the sort, down in the Everglades. And Mrs. Taylor is a colorist, right? And it's this thing that I cannot be great at explaining this inherently, but it is the belief within some African American and I would say just African entities in general, in which, because we have the societal expectation that white is beautiful, that the more white characteristics that a person has, the more beautiful that they are, right? And as this especially gets focused in on a lot in from an outside perspective, viewing this in Latin American communities as well as African American communities, right? And what we see and what we learn is that Ms. Taylor is a full-on complete colorist, right? There's no line to be drawn. She's fully and completely a colorist, and she effectively only wants to be around Janie because Janie has these white characteristics that only came from the fact that both her grandmother and her mother were sexually assaulted by white men who then caused them to give birth, right? And that's one of the reasons that Janie has these white characteristics, right? And so we get this thing of back and forth, right? And eventually the Taylors are forced to move out because, right, everyone learns about this and learns about the Taylors and their, at least Mrs. Taylor's point of view, and everyone's upset by it, right? And clearly so, right? Because it's one of those things in which when you talk about something like Black excellence, you have to acknowledge all of Black excellence, right? You can't pick and choose to say that we're someone slightly different than another because they have different shades, right? It's just one of those things, right? And I'm very bad at explaining it. But it's one of the things that I think has to be talked about with this book. But that's that. And so we go from there, and then we get to the hurricane, right? The hurricane is the big portion of this book. It's really what the whole big thing is. And the hurricane happens, and they decide to actively not take the advice of the Native Americans that are heading east and going inland, right? So they actively choose to ignore that advice because the white landowners are not leaving, right? And that's a decision that Tea Cake effectively makes, in which he decides that he's going to follow, this group of white people rather than the Native Americans that are leaving, right? And it's another one of these things of power and structure and racism. How do we actually, what do those things actually mean, right? This is something that is not like, you wouldn't attribute this to direct racism, but it shows that there's a power structure and a power dynamic involved with race, right? In which wealth and decision making inherently comes from people that own land, and land is disproportionately owned by white Americans, right? And so, right, they make the decision to stay, which then causes them all these other things, right? And the hurricane comes, their eyes were watching God, they're sitting in their house, they're looking at their door, and it's completely dark, and they can't see anything. They don't know what's happening. All they can hear is stuff, but their eyes are glued to the door because it is an act of God, right? That all of this is happening, right? Even if they can't see anything, right? Their eyes are so focused on what is happening and what might happen, even in this emptiness, that the only thing that can be happening is their eyes are watching God. Why do you do this, cat? So that happens. The hurricane sweeps. The levee breaks. The lake comes for them. The lake is effectively, the levees burst. The lake is coming for them at this point. They get to the point of where they're trying to swim. Janie has to try to grab onto a cow to try and stay afloat. A dog starts to attack her. There's a dog on top of the cow, which is a weird thing. Dog starts to attack Janie. TK comes in, saves the day, but the dog bites, like it's a scratch onto tea cake, and they don't worry about it because it's healed 2 or 3 days later. When they eventually go back, right, to the Everglades after the hurricane, right, so they're on the way back, and what eventually happens is we learn that tea cake has contracted rabies, right, presumably from this dog. And eventually what ends up happening is tea cake, in this rabies state, attempts to kill Janie, right, so with a revolver. Janie has realized that this might happen, and so she has set the revolver so it's going to misclick 3 times before, or fire an empty round 3 times before it fires an actual bullet. Janie's bleeding. Janie kills tea cake, right, with a rifle. The bullet that's shot at her goes above her into the banister. She's then arrested, and then once the police hear her story, she's then put on trial within 3 hours, right? And so we're at the trial now, and this is where it comes to intersectionality, right? This is where I would say one of the big cruxes of this book is an understanding, at least my viewpoint of this book really comes to fruition, is that we have this whole situation in which Janie has just killed a very beloved member of the Black community, right? TK is a very beloved member, even though he's not, right, he doesn't hold a lot of power in that way, right? He's still a very beloved person. And through hearing all this, an all-white jury declares that Janie is innocent, right? It effectively becomes an act of mercy, of self-defense, right, that she killed tea cake. And there's basically 3 congregations. There's the all-white male jury. There is the collection of white women that are formal guests, and then we have the collection of the Black community in the back. And when she's declared innocent, right, the Black community is fervently against her, right, and upset and wants her to be tried guilty, right? When this happens, the white women of the audience then protect Janie. She goes and has supper with these women, and once they're there at supper, she's completely ignored and then it basically becomes a, well, she would have never, if she had killed a white man, or if I had killed a white man, then she would certainly be found guilty, right? It's only because she's black that, or because it was a black man that was killed, that she's not found, you know, or because her husband was black that she was found innocent, right? And what ends up happening there, right, is that she's defined by these two intersectionalities, right? The women initially protect her through at the courtroom because she is a woman, but also her entire community that she's been relying on and that she has lived with her whole life has turned against her, right? Because she has taken the life of one of the beloved members of the community. But then when she goes to supper with these women that have just protected her, well, now she's no longer worthy of their attention because she is black, right? And so she has been removed from her own community because of this whole situation. And then she's also been immediately removed from this new society because she doesn't fit in with their expectations, right? It's all about this intersectionality of things, right? There's a very famous court case in which there was a company that said, look, we're not racist or misogynistic. We have X number of, you know, of African American workers, and then we have X number of women, and then, but at no point was this ever cross-referenced of, hey, here's a number of African American women that we have, right? And so, right, there was women that sued because of this. That's a whole thing. If I can remember the case, I will link it. But that's that, right? Yeah, that's The Rise We're Watching God. The book is interesting to read because of two things, right? Number one, it is the first chapter and the last chapter are effectively the present time, and then everything else in between is a flashback, right? It is Janie telling the story to Phoebe, right, about everything that has happened. The other thing that makes this book really, really interesting to read is it is by far the book with, at least that I've read, with the most dialect and vernacular within its own text, right? Or within its own dialogue, right? Everything is spelled out, is effectively spelled out phonetically as how you would say it, right? Which is tricky at first, because you're getting used to how do they use certain words and how do they actually spell certain words. But once you get used to it, it's a very, you know, easy read. It's a very beautiful read, right? But that is, I think that's everything on The Rise We're Watching God.